Okay, well, my name's Richard Orodenker. I don't know where that name comes from. There was a city somewhere in the world called Gorodenker, so maybe that's where we came from, in either Poland or Kiev in Russia, but moved around, I guess.
Wait, then I'm going to start, because you just did that. I'm going to start with an interruption right now, which is, so literally when you track back, there's a point at which we don't know where the people came from, or we don't know what family they came from.
We figure we had some connection to this town, but we're not
Okay.
related. There are Gorodenkers in the world, in the U.S., and we're not related to any of them. So,
Huh.
and there were Horodenkers with an H, and we're not related to any of them. So, at least that we know of. And we first actually heard the town mentioned in a movie starring Danny Kaye.
Whoa.
And it's in one of the songs he sings about all these. I think he plays like the Prussian general or something, and I forget the movie. And he reels off all these cities, and one of them is Horodenker or Worodenker. And we were like shocked. But my late uncle, who was an interesting guy and was a music editor of Billboard magazine in the 30s, he tried to track down our family and couldn't find anyone who was related to us in any way. So. But anyway, that's my name, and I was a teacher for 47 years at all in the Philadelphia area. I started out at a junior college for about 17, 18 years. I took a 10-year hiatus to do some writing, open up a small consulting firm, and taught part-time at Penn State, Community College of Philadelphia. I had my first wife, unfortunately, passed away when she was 50. I went back full-time teaching, and I landed a full-time gig at Temple University in Philadelphia, and that's where I was for the last 17 years of my teaching career.
Okay.
In that time, I wrote 4 books. One of them is a book called The Writer's Game, Baseball Writing in America,
Wow.
which is all about writers of baseball, not fiction writers of baseball, like, let's say, Bernard Malamud, The Natural, or other fiction writers, but nonfiction writers, going back to Ring Lardner, Haywood Broun, the sports writers of the 1930s and 40s, and up until modern day with Roger Angell, if you're a baseball fan, Roger Angell and Tom Boswell. And that book got published and I think sold maybe 25 copies, but got good reviews in the baseball magazines. And I wrote 2 more books on sports writers for American sports writers for a collection called the Dictionary of Literary Biography, which was run by a guy named Matthew Bruckley, who was very famous because he was a biographer and collector of F. Scott Fitzgerald's letters and other writers of that period, Maxwell Perkins, the editor. And then I wrote a book on the Philadelphia Phillies, my local team.
That's the one I saw used when I went hunting. I'm like, has he written anything? That's the one I stumbled onto.
Right. That's the Phillies Reader. And that actually sold out and made money.
Hey, you finally, Phillies fans, right? Sports writing aficionados. Dang it, that's a smaller niche. But just Phillies fans? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was really a collection of essays written by sports writers from all over America, including Philadelphia, about the Phillies from the time of its inception, the team's inception, up until I think the went into a second printing and added a few more pieces when they won the 2007, I think, World Series, up until around that time.
Okay, well then I don't even want to get to the topic yet because I do want to start with that first book. You said the one that sold maybe the worst is the one that's most interesting to me. I remember reading a book from the library years ago when I was doing more journalism, and how to write like the New York Times or how to write like the New Yorker, how to do long, powerful nonfiction pieces, how to how to start them, how to end them, how to weave the storyline. Mm-hmm. And then I got a subscription to Sports Illustrated. I don't care about sports. I'm flipping through. It's a lot of crap. But then you get to the feature and you're like, by the end of the feature, like, oh, I don't care about this sport. I didn't care about this person when I started. And now I'm fascinated by their story. To you, what is like the epitome when you were looking at that book of sports writing? Is there an epitome of like, this is what the pinnacle of sports writing is? Is it that where it transcends the sport? Or is it like, no, it's nestled deep in the sport and that's where it stays?
Well, it's definitely nestled deep in the sport. I mean, baseball is the most literary sport you can imagine. And so much has been written about it. And it was America's game for so many years. I mean, not so much anymore, but even me, I'm more of a football fan these days than I am a baseball fan. But the writing always just fascinated me. I mean, I would spend hours in the library in Penn State when I went undergraduate and just reading, old issues of Sport magazine from the 40s and the 50s, and began literally collecting all these stories, not only in my head, but mimeographing them and photographing them, photostating them back then, how old I am. And I had a whole collection of these things, and I just thought one day I got to do something with this. So,
but what grabbed?
I took a shot. I mean, every book I've published, the two books that I published with major publishers, Temple University Press and Simon and Schuster, it became part of what's called the Twain Literary Series, which was this book by a small publisher, Twain, that got eaten up by a lot of different publishers. And they wrote books about every American writer or British writer or foreign writer, just with a whole literary series. And I just took a stab and I wrote a letter, said, would you be interested in a book on sports, American sports? Wrote back to me and said, yeah, absolutely, let's do it.
Who are the people?
I didn't get any money for it.
But true labor of love. It was just for the love of the game and the craft. Yeah.
What I discovered was, to answer your question, is that baseball writing went through so many changes because it really began in the newspapers. I mean, the sports pages of American. I called it the literature of the breakfast table. That's really what American sports writing was, and great writers writing this stuff who went on to be like Ring Lardner, Paul Gallico, Haywood Broun. I mean, these people were really great American writers in the broader context of writing besides just sports writing, but they cut their teeth in sports writing. And even contemporary writers like Jimmy Breslin, who I met many years later, started out in crime and then wrote sports and then got into, just becoming columnists and writing these great pieces. So baseball evolved from newspaper writing to books written about, these players by good writers, like young adult books about Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. The first book I can remember reading was a biography of Lou Gehrig by Paul Gallico. I mean, that just became that was the literature of my youth.
Do you know how old you are? Did you track it back? Like, it had to have been this year when I checked this out from the library. This was given to me.
I'm thinking maybe it was maybe 6th grade or 5th grade, because the level of the book was probably written for that.
Yeah.
But it was pretty early on when I read that. And then I just began reading all kinds of baseball biographies and stories about baseball. I mean, it was all bull, but, hagiographies, didn't go into any real truth about them off the field. So you kind of idolized. But that was a different America, the sports writers and the baseball players knew to keep that out of the limelight, at least. So they presented a decent picture. And then if they didn't, they would wind up getting booted. So.
Well, it's fascinating because I think with the sports writing today in general, I see it is exactly the opposite. People want, on the positive side, it's what I was talking about, the human, the timeless lessons that come out of people's lives. And on the other side, it's salacious personal life. Well, anybody can report the numbers, but can I find out something you did in your private time? What club you went to? Who's your friend? What you said on the podcast? Yeah.
Yeah. And Jim Bouton, when he wrote Ball 4, kind of made that into the new thing, that kind of. So you got a whole slew of books after his, and it's not a great book, Ball 4, really. I mean, it's not, it just was the right book at the right time for the right audience. So.
Or depending on your attitude toward it, the wrong book at the right time.
A lot of people did disparage. It's kind of like Portnoy's Complaint with Philip Roth,
Yeah.
So I began to track all those books down, the biographies, and guys like Bob Creamer and Arnold Haino, who I got to know. I got to know a lot of these guys. Harold Rosenthal, who wrote for the New York Herald Tribune, which had the best sports page in America. Red Smith, of course. So I did a whole. Initially I was thinking I would just focus on maybe 4 or 5 of them, but then I began to find that there were so many of them who were so good, writing these great feature pieces on these players, or not just baseball, but other sports too, which I covered in my broader book on sports writing. But just wonderful, wonderful writing. And I don't think you see that today in the sports pages. I don't think. I think Tom Boswell at the Washington Post was really the last really great sports writer in that older tradition.
The good stuff is passed on. So we're talking about published books you've done, and I think it's interesting. Maybe, I guess the segue into this would be, I reached out to you because of Commonplace books. So, hopefully you can start with, this is what a Commonplace book is, but it gets deployed by writers. So when you described, I went to the library, I'm gathering up all the stuff, but I don't know how I'm going to use it. I'm like, oh, that sounds like you might have had a Commonplace book.
Well, it's a good segue because it kind of gets to how we got to this point. I collected this material, and as I collected this material and read it, something grabbed me in that book, and I wrote it down in a book and made sure I cited it properly and had the right author and the right material, the right source. And so when I wrote my baseball book, I had a lot of stuff already to work with, great quotes and from great stories and great magazines and great biographies. And that's what that's where I went. So the Commonplace book has a kind of a different, history to it. Something I always did was to write stuff down. It wasn't always in a book. Sometimes I would take like scraps of paper for backs of receipts, and I'm writing stuff down, whether it's ideas from my own writing or whether it's a quote from someone. And then I just decided I got to put this down, all the stuff down. I had stacked some paper on my desk. So I began saying, all right, so I'll begin writing these down in the books. And that's what I began doing. So now I have, if you can see this, like.
I was going to ask you how long your quotes went, and just by eyeballing that, I can say some of those quotes are multi-paragraph quotations.
Well, some are. Now, a little misleading here. Half the left side of this is the journal. Okay, that's my writing, and this side is the Commonplace book. But
gotcha.
But there are some very lengthy quotes. They can go very long. Here's one on motherhood that goes very long. And that comes from Tarzan of the Apes, actually.
Oh, you went wide, very wide ranging.
Oh, yeah, I always write from what I read,
Right.
And just the other day, I was watching a play by Alan Bennett. If you remember Beyond the Fringe, Alan Bennett was one of the 4. Peter Cook, Dudley Moore. I know that might be before your time, but
it might be. But now it's another thing to dig into. Beyond the Fringe.
Oh yeah, they're great. It was very, very funny. It was that whole wacky crew that Peter Sellers became part of it in Britain. And he did a play called The Habit of Being. So those are my last quotes in my most recent Commonplace book. But anyway, that's what I did. And then I was teaching, because I taught humanities, so I'm teaching great books. Well, they were great books up until the very end when they started to throw the great
now
books.
They're lowercase g, lowercase b. They're still great books. They're just not great books.
What they're teaching now. They're really crappy books, but that's a different debate for another day and a different opinion. But anyway, I taught, Homer, I taught Socrates, I taught Marcus Aurelius, which his Meditations is a Commonplace book.
Not intended for publication.
Not intended for publication. It published after his death, but it was only for him. It was for him to become a better person. But I used that to, when I was talking about it and I was teaching Marcus, and I said, you know what? Why don't we? I actually at that moment told my students, let's keep a Commonplace book. I'm going to throw out the tests at the end of the year.
Okay.
I don't want to grade it anyway. So,
Yeah.
so I said, let's throw it out and let's keep a commonplace book like Marcus does. Put quotes in there from things you've read. If you think I said something worthwhile, you could put it in. You could even put in stupid stuff if you want, things you think are stupid, but make a comment on it. There's a very famous story, by the way, really quick, that I think when Judge Hugo Black died, somebody went through his library and found a copy of a book that was called The Greening of America, which was a horrible book published back in the 60s. And he had some underlined stuff in there. And at the funeral, the person who found that book decided to read that paragraph, and one of the judges who was in at this chapel said, "The hell is he reading that from?" I mean, Hugo thought that was the stupidest crap he's ever read in his life, So I told him, if you put something in there that you object to or you think is wrong, put a little comment as to why you think you disagree with it. And students kind of got into it, and then I decided to make it part of my curriculum, and that's how the Commonplace Book project came about. So I took a sabbatical, I developed my website, and then COVID came along and retirement came along. So I've been doing a lot of other things, but I still have a great interest in it.
If you'd done it earlier, maybe you had, a la Ryan Holiday, would have gone on a massive crusade to try to get America to commonplace again.
Well, in doing the project, I discovered other teachers who also had their students kept wasn't an original idea on my part.
And I also like on the website collects any places you could find people who included that in curriculum or had published studies
so
about it.
I linked to their pages, and if they're still out there, that's great. And but I haven't really been on top of it so much since I've been out of academia. And on the tennis court, I was usually teaching. So. I prefer the latter. well over. Teaching became. I retired at the right time. Not only was our curriculum totally trash, but it became almost impossible to do what I do on campus, which is to challenge students and to, hit them with something that I want them to think about, even if they're offended by it, and to understand, how you respond to that.
Okay, I want to come back to the Commonplace book, sure. But I've spoken to a number of academics, and again, if they're older, if they've been there for decades, there is a general, things are changing. So from one perspective, it's things are changing. The old guys and the old girls, they don't get it, this new generation. To you, if you're kind of more discerning, not just I don't like these changes, but I think these changes are actually rough on what we are trying to teach the kids. And then when I look out at the world, I think we're missing something. By losing the capital G, capital B great books, or by grinding up the humanities in whatever way you saw ground up, can you identify ways you're that are not just I hate these young whippersnappers with their stuff, but this is a real problem, and this is going to foment a problem down the line.
Right, exactly. I mean, I taught contemporary books in my classes as well, but I was very selective on them. I wanted books that, weren't trying to proselytize anything or to politicize anything, but to get them to think. How does this book get you to think?
Okay, then I'll just play devil's advocate. You're not proselytize or politicize, and then of course the people push back. What are you talking about? When we look at these books that you're teaching, they're all about proselytizing and they're all about politicizing. It's all about politics. Again, the personal is political, the political personal. We hear that motto thrown around.
I tried to make them understand why it's not and how it's not. When they ask me, they always want to have what is the prompt that we have to write about. I never gave prompts when I was teaching. I simply said, I don't want to know what you think. I want to know what these texts got you to think about. What did they get you to think about? What hit you, even if you couldn't understand everything?
Yeah.
Is there something in them that spoke out to you? And if it's something that offended you, well, that's something to write about.
Yes.
Tell me why that offended you. Let's make sure as you're discussing this, you're going to be accurate as to, you know, what the author actually said, not because you're sensing something else. Oh, he's just a white male, dead white male. Well, you know, that's not a critique.
Right.
Because I don't have to tell you, we don't know who Homer was. We don't even know who Homer was. We don't even know who wrote the Bible. Harold Bloom said, maybe a woman wrote the Bible. He thought a woman wrote the Bible.
What are you talking about? We talked earlier about being Jewish. It was handed down from God's mouth to Moses. Moses wrote it down at Sinai. We know where the Bible came from.
Right. Well, if you believe that literally.
Right. That's one literal. Right.
Right. But when I taught the Bible, I said, look, we're not teaching the Bible here as religion. We're teaching the Bible as literature. When you're in church or when you're in synagogue or whatever, and I taught the Quran too, we're teaching it as literature. So we can get those who are not of this belief
right.
Try to understand what it says and why people believe what it says. And you don't still have to, you can, as you read these books, you don't have to believe them. You can go back to your opinion once you're out of the class.
So if that is a thing that's being pushed out, is a thing really being pushed out? Did it feel like the classes were designed? For instance, I thought it was interesting. My 15-year-old, she's going to her sophomore year. It's now in the sophomore year. There's 2 classes they can take for a half-year semester thing. One is women's studies and one is Black history, which I think, I'm like, oh, both those sound awesome. But it smacks of the political, and it smacks of like there's an underserved thing that there's an underserved community or a community that's been pushed aside, and we need to give them power and agency, and we need to look at them and learn about them. And that seems good. Is there any problem with that? What was the push in your humanities for you that kind of ground up the curriculum? What books were you asked to throw away, and what books were you required, or did other new teachers seem really wanted to teach? And you're like, I don't really know why you're teaching this, but okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, the younger teachers do feel that way, and that's what they wanted. And I didn't have to worry about it because I was retired when the new curriculum went into place.
Yeah.
But I think the problem with it is that it focuses only on that agency, only on that authenticity, only on that particular intersectional item, whatever it is, whether it's transsexual, disability, gay, female, Black, whatever, to the point where we would have maybe 4 or 5 books that all students read that were required of all students who took our course, and then we could teach 4 books of our own or something like that. I don't know what the new deal is. And of those, I think 4 or 6 required books now, there's not one white male writer anymore. No Homer, no Socrates, if you want to call them white. There's none of that. They're gone. You can still teach them if you want. You can still select those to teach yourself, but they're not part of the required curriculum. It's a trans book, a gay book, a disability book, a feminist book, a Black radical book. That's the new curriculum.
This gets to so in one respect, you can look at this giant political, social, historical, cultural block of white men who created this civilization. And so we want to look at other things. But that was whether you liked them or you didn't, whether you like the Bible or don't like the Bible, to be versed in Western civilization or be versed in the modern world in all their references. If you cut that reference off, it's like this tree of like, even if you don't like the Bible, it's a big tree in the forest. So you have to know where the tree is and what it looks like and what its branches look like. If you just chop the tree off or like, I'm just not going to look at that tree, it basically closes off. I think it closes you off to history. So there's this history that the whole mass believed or read or thought, and you're cutting yourself off from that.
Right, and not just your history. I mean, we were called, or the name of our course was Intellectual Heritage.
I really liked. I saw that name. I dug that. Yes,
they actually would like to get rid of that. I don't know if they're eventually going to, but that's the next step because it smacks of sort of Western,
right,
the old-fashioned Western humanities. But that heritage is important. I mean, the fact that you can get to change the course in the democratic way you're changing the course is because of those people you are throwing out of the course. Like Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, which very few students who came to college had actually even read.
Right.
That was a shocker to me when I first started there.
I did. I remember as a grad student in English Lit, I had this thing where we were surveying all the English 101 courses across as many universities across the nation as we could get them to send in what's your curriculum. The number one taught book, and this was back in, so let's say 97 or 96, the number one taught book across these major universities that sent our thing in English 101 was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I think is awesome for all kinds of reasons. Yeah, but not.
That was a book that we used to teach actually in the old.
Really? Okay, you guys were in the Frankenstein group.
Yeah, very much. We were when I first got there. That was the Frankenstein group. So obviously the course changed a little bit, got tweaked several times when I was still there, but we still pretty much held on to that core. That's what it was designed for, to have this core course. In addition to students at Temple taking race courses and other courses as well, gen ed courses as well. So I was disappointed to see the course lose that, that foundation that it was designed for. And I think it hurts. The students are missing something by not getting that and not understanding that those are ideas that speak to everyone, even people who were not included in it, like in ancient Greece, where only men could be citizens of Greece and have a voice in Greek society. But they paved the way so that could eventually change.
To opine over much and take your micro world of the academy and bring it, let's say, all of civilization or all of culture or all of America. If you snip the ties to the old texts and the old traditions, if you just cut them whole cloth, these are problematic. These have things in them: slavery, abuse, misogyny, sexism, racism that we don't like. We have to cut that person and all their thinking out. And you cut all that stuff off, I'm not sure where people get, where does the tradition or the values come from? I think there's a feeling that, well, we can just invent this, or we can go out into the all the tradition of all the written texts and find things. We can find things that match up, but I think what people are doing are matching. I don't think they recognize where their values come from, and I don't think they recognize how the values they're running off are their own biases. I feel this way, so I'm going to look for things that confirm that. We all do that, but I think it's getting more extreme. If you cut all the old things away, it gets more extreme.
Yeah, and bias confirmation is brutal. I mean, it's you articulated it very well. This is where the values come from. You don't understand. You think they don't come from these things,
right?
Part of what you say, I mean, my son, for instance, he would argue with me sometimes, especially with the Trump stuff and everything, and goes, "Well, he's immoral and he's all these things." And I said, "Well, you don't believe in God, you disassociate yourself from Judaism. Where does your morality come from? How do you make that statement if you believe that? All right, so he's immoral. Where did your system of morality come from? Go read the Bible. That's your morality system. Right. All right. You can have that critique of Donald Trump or anyone you want to, but understand when you say that and then you deny, well, I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in God. Okay, fine. But your values do. The values you're expressing are coming from that. They're not coming whole cloth from you. You're not, And even if they are, the Bible writers recognized that before anyone else did way back.
So I think people are still reflecting. So now I'll bring it back to the Commonplace book. I'm wondering about the experience of reading. We all read things. We're reading things on screens. We're reading things on newsprint. We're reading things in magazines, books. We're having things read to us on podcasts. And we're walking around or driving the ball on the golf course. Information's coming in, but it comes in faster than ever. And there's this weird thing about the Commonplace book developed at a slower time when writing. You can't get this off the internet. No one else knows it. I'm getting a chance to borrow this book. I'm going to write down what I find in this book because I might not find this book again, or I might forget. And then to reflect on it, this seems like a slow process of taking things in and then writing it down by hand, another slow process. And then in proximity to that, reflecting on why it caught your eye or why you agree or don't agree with it. I don't think this is a lot of what's being done with the way we're consuming things right now. So maybe you could talk about how you think the Commonplace fits in today.
Well, it doesn't in some ways because you could just go online, find a quote, paste it. A lot of students did that when they were collecting their Commonplace books. I said you might want to at least change your fonts, But you can certainly go find the quote of the day or go to Bartlett's and read that and get a quick education and all great ideas, a lot of great ideas. But there's something about encountering something you've read, something you've heard. I even said, even if it's oral, a lot of my students would quote, like I said, quote your mom or your dad if they told you something and you thought that was something that you want to remember. Write it down in your Commonplace book. Your minister, your rabbi, your imam, your priest, whatever. Whoever. They said something that was meaningful to you. Write that down.
Yes.
There's also a process that when you're writing these things down, you're absorbing them. They're becoming, you're beginning to read them, not just write them, but to understand why you're writing them down and trying to understand those quotes. Sometimes I'll do that with a quote. I'll start writing it, and then I'll say, this. I don't really know why I wrote this.
I've had that.
It sounded good at the time,
right?
And now writing it down, it doesn't seem to me, worth putting in. And I begin to erase it. And I'll put, something else in. But I also wanted them to encounter, because they had to write papers too. So when you're quoting, you have a book in front of you where your quotes are written down. So you don't have to go searching for them in your books because most of them don't underline them anyway. They want to resell them at the end of the semester. Of course. So I would say you have that in front of you. It's like a little notebook with all your ideas from the semester. And, I said even include quotes that you got in your other classes. And students would say to me, well, I get math and science courses. That's all I get. I said, you know what? Put a brilliant equation down, or down.
Yeah, I've been inspired by math equations before. Right. Like, holy crap, it works like that. Yeah,
right. And I had a few students do it, and I said, often I would ask them to do a little explanation of why they use the quote, so at least I know it's coming somewhat first. And they would explain, well, this is a very famous quotation. I don't know much math, but Fermati or something like that.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah,
So write that down. And why is that so intriguing? Because nobody can solve it or something like that. So I would say that's fine. There's something elegant about that.
But people
that was included too.
The interesting thing you mentioned about every student, there's always a handful, maybe the majority of students. What's the easiest way I can get through that course? Their focus is not on I want to make myself better through these 4 months or 5 months of this course. I want to get through it and get a grade and move on to something else. This is just a secondary goal. The primary goal is something else. If the primary goal is to learn these Commonplace books, how do they, I've read so many books in my life and I've written stuff down everywhere. What do you think the Commonplace book does different than I saw something and underline it and then it's a book on my shelf? Is it really the process of sifting through, seeing something, noting it, writing it down physically, and then commenting it on right there? Is it really just trying to every chance to press it a little firmer into the brain? What actually do you think the Commonplace book does?
Well, it does that. That's essentially what they were for. They were originally they were a memory device because you wouldn't have that book. It might have been passed down to you or you borrowed it. Commonplace books were at a time where still many people were illiterate and couldn't read or write. So it was a very highly educated sort of process as well. But it oftentimes, like for instance, Copernicus, when he wrote his book on the revolutions, and that book was published after his death, and then it got passed around. There was only a few copies that got passed around, and many of them in the margins are written, comments and quotations, either for comments on what's happening in the book or correcting something that Copernicus might have said. And that became very, very valuable for further scholars to understand as it got better, more widely circulated and better understood. So a lot of people do that in the book. They underline.
Yep. And
if that works for you, that's fine. I don't. There's something about writing in a book that I don't like. So
you're one of those. I know. I got it.
I had to write in books because when I was teaching, I needed to. So I would buy 2 copies, or I would always have 2 copies, one for my shelf. And then, as I began collecting books, including Commonplace books, I began to feel, well, that's not so bad now, because I collect some plays, and I have plays that were done by directors, and I have their comments and their cross-outs in there, what they're not going to include in their play, or changes that they made. So I began to find that more interesting, especially as I was doing my Commonplace book stuff. But people aren't reading today as much,
right?
Or if they're reading today, they're not reading what I taught. But between Kindles and people not reading as much today, I don't think this sort of thing is happening anymore, where people actually read a book and then write stuff down that they saw or underline stuff anymore. I think they just read the book and they want to have a good read and then move on to something else.
Okay, now we'll test your feelings on elitism. So you mentioned,
I'll put that out there. So go ahead.
Oh wait, say.
I'm an elitist.
But well, then I could have guessed.
I'm a democratic elitist.
Well, to be clear, the ancient Greeks have sold me on the problems with democracy. So I Republican democracy, I like. Pure democracy, what? Thousands of years ago, they already warned us about this. Let's not do that. But anyway, okay, elitism. Once upon a time, these humanities courses, at their worst, these kinds of universities were finishing schools for the elite and powerful. So you're going to rise up into a position of power. You need to know these certain things. You need to learn these certain things. You're going to fit into this group. Once the university and literacy is open to everybody, is there a chance that some of these things in the humanities are not global and universal? That most people don't want to emulate a great thinker and delve into all the ways in which they became that great thinker. Even if it's you could be into Shaquille O'Neal, and I want to be like Shaquille O'Neal, and I want to dig into how he thinks, how his childhood works, how he makes his business decisions. That's kind of like the stuff you dig into in the Commonplace. How did this person think? Do most people not really want to know on a deep level how their idols think or how these things operate?
Right. I think, unless you really are pursuing a more classical liberal education, which is not so much anymore for a lot of people. I don't think people do that. I just don't think it's. Commonplace books went out of fashion by the end of the 19th century. I think very much near the end of the 19th century. But a few writers in the 20th century kept commonplace books. Now, W.H. Auden, for instance. And Noel Coward actually did a commonplace book too. That's very interesting. Yeah. There's a few 20th century people who have very interesting commonplace books, but it's other than writers, maybe like myself, who are sort of honed on commonplace books, and some younger ones, because I've gotten letters from some young writers who keep commonplace books. I just think it's a rare thing today. I don't think many people, do that anymore.
But does that, I was going to ask you how you use the Commonplace book, but we kind of started that in the beginning, which is oftentimes a writer's tool. I went digging, who talks about Commonplace books? And there's that there's a ton list. Somebody found out about a Commonplace book and they found out people would click on it. So there's like 87 websites that all write the same article about Commonplace books on like selfhelp.net and globalconsciousness.org and blah, blah, blah. Ryan Holiday, that's how he writes his books. He's got, probably picked it up again from the diaries from Marcus, but he puts all his ideas on index cards and he goes and sorts through the index cards to produce a book. And most of us are not going to ever produce a book or a written work. So then, is that what the Commonplace book, do you think that's what the Commonplace book is for? It's for writers to sort their thoughts so they can produce their writing work.
Yeah, I think so, and also to remember good writing. To keep that in mind as models of good writing. I would always, when I was teaching writing courses, which I actually went to graduate school for. I went to Johns Hopkins writing program, studied with John Barth there. I would tell students, get a good piece of writing. Find one really good piece of writing and keep that on your desk. And I remember other writers telling me they do the same thing. And use that as a model. I mean, before you write your essay for class, reread that essay that really grabbed you by that writer.
Yeah.
And this isn't just picking out a quote. This was the actual piece of writing. And I told them, if you don't have one, I'm going to give you one to read. and when I was teaching basic composition writing, I would teach, for instance, Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell.
Yeah.
I would say, here's just writing where from beginning to end, if you can find something wrong with this, tell me. This is as good a piece of writing as you're going to find about a very personal and controversial subject, which has to do with, colonialism and having to shoot an animal that he doesn't want to shoot.
Yes.
And I don't know what I got, back from them in return for that. But
you're not sure Orwell seeped into their brain enough to affect what came out of it.
I only hope that it would. That's all I could do. I could hope that here is a good model of writing. And when you find good models of writing, all right, if you don't want to collect them, that's fine. But maybe there's something in them that you really, really like. Write it down. Write it down so you have it. Or you have a memory of it in some way. And if it speaks to you, it really changes your life in some way. That's or it makes you laugh. I have hundreds of George Carlin quotes in my Commonplace book. I met him too, by the way.
Oh, wow.
That's another story. But write these things down. The more you write down, not only are you beginning to get absorbing good writing and good ideas, which you can emulate, but you'll have something to remember, something to keep in mind as you get old. So,
where is that? So there's a current, again, I mentioned Ryan Holiday because he's a business, he's a businessy dude who got obsessed in his college dorm room with Marcus Aurelius. Oh my God, Stoicism's the answer. And he's been currently selling us for now more than 10 years that Stoicism's the answer. I love Stoicism. But he sells, again, self-reflection, self-analysis, ethical evaluation, constant ethical evaluation, things that come out of Stoicism. Some of these things, the journal and the diary and the Commonplace book kind of nestle together. And again, we mentioned at the beginning, Marcus Aurelius had no intention of producing a written work out of his diary. This was him trying to wrestle with being emperor and what human life should be and how it should be governed, blah, blah, blah. How does journal for you and Commonplace for learning good writing as a tool and a skill to use later, do those come together perfectly, or do you see journal and Commonplace as different things?
No, they come together, which is why I now have a journal / not separate books. I have them right next to one another because sometimes...
Oh, they're not related. You don't put the quote and I must write about the quote right next to it on the facing page.
Oh, no. Okay. I might write about the quote, I might not, but the left side, I even... For future reference, I always want to indicate that this is journal side, this is the quote side, and sometimes if I'm doing it, I'll just put a little arrow there to indicate that I'm writing about that quote. But mostly it's my journal, but the two have a lot in common because a lot of these things inspire me to write. I might write a similar kind of article from that.
Yeah.
From something I write similar on the subject, with a different point of view. So I do think these two things, and I tried to do that in my classes, which were writing-based classes. Even the humanities class was writing-based. It was more reading than writing, but they had to write. And I wanted to join these two together. So I said, use those quotes in your the papers that you write. When you have to write 2 or 3 papers or whatever for the year, make sure you incorporate those quotes coming from your Commonplace book. That's what they're there for. So I do believe it. It's a commonplace. It's joining reading and writing. Reading and writing just, married or just married. They're just it might be an incestuous marriage, but they're married. They're married.
Is there any, if the Commonplace book is seeking for truth, I'm wondering, I went and dug it up, Plato's Socrates complaint. He's got the complaint about the written word famously, yes, where he's like, he has a problem. And again, he's lamenting, we used to memorize things. That does a different thing. You hold it in you and you have to do it in the moment. So if you say something to me, I can question you back. And Plato's Socrates says, well, if I read something, I can't question you back. I don't know what you were thinking. It's right, crappy. Do you have the same thought that Socrates has about oral to written as written to not nonverbal, but visual communication or tweets, things moving so fast we don't reflect on them? Do you, like Socrates, think back on the previous medium, reading and writing? This is a way to coach your brain. Should we be doing this? Or are you like, oh, there's new media to reflect on, and so we'll use those new media?
Well, we're doing that more now. I mean, right, because of even like these podcast kinds of things and stuff like that. So we're able to, confront each other and talk. And of course, that was how I taught my classes. I said, well, we've read the material. You're going to go home and write stuff. But while we're in the classroom, we're going to be, this is verbal communication.
Right.
I'm not looking, I don't even look at notes when I'm teaching because, I have them prepared ahead of time because sometimes you have to when
right,
things aren't working. But most of the times I'm saying, let's see where this goes. Let's take this conversation to whatever end it's going to have. And if it's a dead end, then we'll go somewhere else. So that idea of Socratic dialogue, I think, is very important. That doesn't happen a lot on college campuses anymore.
Right.
It's either lectures or you're in a lab. Our class was one of the few classes where we could have these Socratic dialogues. And then it became, unfortunately, I don't want to have this dialogue. This dialogue offends me. I don't want to have this conversation. When one of my last classes, abortion came up,
yeah,
in context of how to have a civil conversation. That was what we were talking about. How do you have a civil conversation? So let's use abortion, for example. How do we have a civil conversation about abortion? And I sort of laid a groundwork. I said, let's say we put 2 things off the table. No abortions ever. Abortions whenever you want them. Kind of like that Simpsons, the 2 aliens, remember? One said abortions for everyone, no abortions for none.
Right.
I said, let's throw that off the table so we can meet. Let's see where the middle is. Who knows? It might be center left. It might be center right. There might be no middle here. And then one student, just a female student, got up and said, I don't want to hear from any male in this class that have anything to say with abortion whatsoever. I don't want to hear from one male in this class. So, no, I said no. No.
I can't institute that rule. Okay.
Yeah. Number 2, they vote just like you. They might have a daughter one day and a wife one day, and might have a stake in this debate, don't you think?
Right.
And once we got that out of the way, we managed to have. She wasn't happy about it, but we managed to get that conversation going somehow.
This cutting either certain topics verboten. I mean, I'm a huge fan of taboo, and actually I think in religion sets up magical taboo. I mean, God literally sets up these rules. In Judaism, rules about taboo and not taboo, and sometimes doesn't explain it. So this is simply taboo. It's forbidden to you. Some things are forbidden and some things are not. So I understand taboo and we shouldn't talk about certain things. There are certain ways we shouldn't talk about them. But yeah, this idea, if we're trying to set up a place where we can talk openly about stuff, right, if we set up rules and we are all going to be civil to each other, we should be able to talk about anything. But clearly that isn't some people, there are certain topics they don't want to hear.
Well, here's the thing you have to remember about that. The rabbis and the Talmudists, they had to have that debate before they could get to what is taboo and what is not taboo.
True.
So when God says it's taboo, that might be the final word on the subject. They still had to figure out some things before they said this you can't do. So, thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What the hell does that mean? How do you get from that you can't eat milk with meat?
Right.
You have to have 2 sets of dishes. You have to wait 3 hours after meat to have dairy. How do you get from that to that taboo? No, you can't do this. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. Or, oh, yes, you can do this. Or, yes, you can't do that. You have to have that civil debate first. And sometimes those debates weren't very civil and with the rabbis, but sometimes they were. But that's the point. You have to have these conversations before you can say, no male is allowed to speak in this class. I want to know how we get to that. It's not because you're God in this instance. You don't get to play God in this instance. And say,
that is my favorite thing about the Talmudic discourse.
I can play God in my classroom. You can't.
Yeah, right. I have executive fiat here because it's my classroom. But yeah, the arguing, the back and forth, and also, again, one of the beautiful things about Talmud is the fact that the arguments that lose are argued in good faith and recorded accordingly for all posterity.
And there it is. A Talmud is part commonplace book, if not all commonplace book. And that's the thing about commonplace books that I try to make on my website and my introduction there is that it has a tradition of what commonplace looked like at a certain time and how they were structured, but there's so many hybrids of them, and they appear in so many different ways and different forms, and they're ways in which we learn from. They're important tools for learning, and I thought they were in my class. And when students talked about the class, they never complained about the commonplace book. So that's one. I didn't get a complaint for that. I might have got a complaint for other things.
Yeah, you actually talked about here's how the students reflected on this, and sounded like the biggest problem was understandably what almost every student. I never did this because I was a nerd and I like whatever. But some people leave it to the last. What's the most efficient way to use my time? How can I maximize? I'm at the very end of the course. Can I push this? And final projects are notorious for being unable to rush them at the end. So like you said, the commonplace book, you can go dig up quotes on the internet and pretend like you're reflecting on them, but it clearly doesn't show that you've spent months rolling this stuff over in your head.
Yeah, and obviously there's very little way for me to know whether they actually did that or not.
Right.
But my attitude simply became, look, this is your dollar. You're paying for this. If this is how you want to do it, go ahead and do it that way. But I'm trying to give you some things you can really benefit from in life, no matter what you do, because you could be a doctor or a scientist or a lawyer and keep a commonplace book, which is just devoted to what you're doing. So I think a lot of students kind of appreciated that a little bit at the end as a sort of unique project that they didn't get anywhere else. And some students even came to me a year later and said, I'm still keeping a commonplace book, Mr. O. So
yeah, it worked for some.
Yeah, it worked for some. And I'm happy, even if I get, look, if you're a poet and you write 10 great poems, you're a great poet. So if 1,000 students, I get 5 or 6 that got something. I consider that a victory. So.
Did you ever, last question, did you ever have, if commonplace books or something else, was there ever your big axe to grind or the big flag you carried around in your humanities work that like, I think every university should be doing this, or I think this is the class of books or the writer or the kind of books that people don't read enough of? Did you ever have something you like banged on for a while, or now in retirement, you're like, I'm going to spend my time, I'm got at this new project, I'm going to bang on about this thing that I didn't do in academics?
Well, from what I taught,
yeah,
I banged on the great books, as you said, capital G, capital B. I said there's certain books I think that, as with a college education, you should read these books. whether it's in a humanities class or an English class or any one of your classes, there's a canon that we can agree upon. And we can expand this canon. We can dump stuff from it. We can jettison others. We can include new ones. But, there's got to be some kind of criteria for why they're there and why they've lasted so long.
Right.
And Shakespeare, of course. And I kind of insisted, you need to read these books. But I also began to harp with my students and tell them that if you need to take a required math course or you need to take a required science course, I really think I would require, if I were the dean of, Orodenker University, every student would take a course in statistics and every student would take a course in neuroscience. Those would be the two cutting edge courses I think every student needs to know in the 21st century. So I would say I would make that the part of the core curriculum in addition to humanities and American literature and British and world literature.
Statistics to wrestle with all the data that is shoved upon us and analyzed and translated, and the neuroscience for understanding what we know best medically and scientifically about your consciousness and your ego and self.
Right. And to get to that point, obviously, you should have a decent high school education. Right. Biology, the basic units of all those and math and geometry and trigonometry. But when you get to college, I would say definitely required statistics and required neuroscience courses. I would do to have a better educated population in this country.